Before the word family ever meant safety, before blood was something you trusted, there were names in America that learned too late what happens when lineage becomes a prison. This is not a story meant to be remembered. It is a story written into bone, stitched into flesh, and whispered through generations that never escaped their own last name. And they didn't know they were becoming a case study. They didn't wake up one morning and decide to carve a legacy of damage into the future. It began quietly, the way all real horrors do. A valley too far from roads. A family too isolated from change. A belief that the outside world was something to fear, not join. And generation by generation, choice by choice, blood folded inward on itself until the past could no longer be separated from the present. And this legacy was not built by violence alone. It was built by repetition, by familiarity, by the lie that keeping blood pure meant keeping it safe. Fathers married cousins. Mothers were born from sisters who never left. Children grew up knowing only the faces that looked like theirs. The same eyes, the same bones, the same narrow world that never expanded beyond the tree line. And then when deformities began to appear, they didn't call them warnings. They called them God's will. When intelligence faded from one generation to the next, they didn't see decline. They saw destiny. When illness arrived early and death came often, it was accepted as the cost of staying together, because leaving meant betrayal, and betrayal in this family was worse than suffering, and America likes to imagine itself as a land of movement, of migration, of escape. But there are places where the map stopped changing decades ago, places where surnames outlived roads and families became ecosystems unto themselves. In these places, isolation was not accidental, it was enforced. Outsiders weren't welcomed. Schools were avoided, doctors were distrusted. Government was something that happened to other people. And so the bloodline thickened. And what happens when a family tree stops branching, when it bends inward, looping back on itself again and again until the roots choke the trunk? Science would eventually give it a name. Genetics would draw diagrams. Doctors would write papers. But long before the world labeled it, the damage was already walking, breathing, being born into cribs that never stood a chance. And children arrived with eyes that didn't align, limbs that never fully formed, minds that aged slower than bodies. Some never spoke, some never learned. Others lived long enough to understand something was wrong, but not long enough to escape it. And through it all, the family endured, not because it was strong, but because it was sealed. And there is a particular kind of horror in knowing you were doomed before you were named. That your fate was decided generations earlier, by people who believed love meant never letting go, even when letting go was the only way to survive. In this family, DNA became a diary. Every birth added another sentence. Every death underlined what came before, and the outside world would eventually notice. Not at first. At first there were rumors, then photographs, then whispered questions about why no one married out, why no one left, why no one seemed normal. But by the time attention arrived, the damage was irreversible. You cannot reverse a century of silence. You cannot undo blood that has already been shared too many times. And this is not a story about monsters. That word is too easy. Monsters are born from imagination. This legacy was born from neglect, fear, and isolation, from a refusal to change wrapped in the language of tradition. It is about people who did not know how to leave, and children who paid the price for that ignorance. And when historians finally dug into the records, they didn't find a single moment where everything went wrong. They found thousands of small moments where nothing was done. No intervention, no escape, no break in the cycle. Just the slow, quiet stacking of genetic consequences until the family itself became evidence. And here is the most unsettling truth of all. This didn't happen in some distant, medieval past. This happened in modern America. While cities grew and highways expanded, while laws changed and medicine advanced, this bloodline remained frozen in time, repeating itself like a curse that no one dared to name. And what you're about to hear is not speculation. It is not legend. It is the documented result of isolation meeting biology, of love turning inward until it suffocated everything it touched. This is the most inbred legacy written in DNA, and the deeper we go, the harder it becomes to look away. And they didn't keep records the way the outside world did. No birth certificates neatly filed, no medical charts tracing decline. What existed instead were memories passed mouth to ear, distorted by time and necessity, names repeated until they lost meaning, dates blurred, relationships tangled until no one could say where one generation ended and the next began. And in this family, lineage wasn't something you studied. It was something you lived inside of. Every face carried echoes of the last. Every child was born into a room already crowded with ghosts, and at first, the changes were subtle. A child who learned to speak later than expected. Another who never quite learned at all. A boy who struggled to walk without stumbling, his joints loose, his balance uncertain. These weren't seen as signs. They were explained away as quirks. Every family has them, they said. Every bloodline has its weak ones. But the weak ones began to outnumber the strong. And by the time outsiders occasionally passed through, a traveling worker, a distant official, a lost hiker, there was something unmistakable in the air. A silence that felt rehearsed, eyes that watched without curiosity, smiles that arrived too late or not at all. The family didn't ask questions of strangers, and strangers learned quickly not to ask questions of them. And because questions led to answers, and answers led to attention, and attention was the enemy, and doctors were avoided unless absolutely necessary. And when they did come, they didn't stay long. They wrote notes they never shared aloud. They spoke in careful tones, choosing words that wouldn't provoke anger or fear. They knew what they were seeing, even if the family refused to hear it. Patterns too consistent to ignore. Symptoms that lined up too perfectly across siblings, cousins, parents. But science means nothing to people who don't trust the world that invented it. And so the cycle continued. Children born to people who never should have shared blood. Mothers too young, fathers too close in relation to deny. The family tree tightened, folding inward like a knot pulled too hard. Genetic traits that should have been diluted instead became concentrated. Recessive mutations rose to the surface and stayed there, and eyes crossed in ways no surgery could correct. Facial bones grew asymmetrically, as if the blueprint itself had been smudged. Immune systems weakened, lifespans shortened, and perhaps most tragic of all, cognition slowed not suddenly, but gradually, until whole branches of the families struggled to understand the danger they were living inside. And that's the cruelest part of genetic collapse. Eventually, the very thing that could save you, awareness, becomes one of the first casualties, and children grew into adults who could not read, could not reason abstractly, could not imagine a life beyond the boundaries they had always known. Leaving required understanding that there was something to escape from. And for many of them, that understanding never arrived. And so they stayed, and they married who was available. And they had children because that's what people did, not because they wanted to continue the bloodline, but because stopping it was never presented as an option. And inside the family, suffering became normal. Pain was expected. Death was familiar. When a baby didn't survive, it was mourned quietly, briefly, then folded into routine. When a child survived but was clearly impaired, they were cared for with a strange mixture of love and resignation. No one asked why this kept happening. Asking why meant admitting something was wrong, and in wrongness threatened the only thing holding them together, the belief that they were fine as they were, and from the outside, it would later look like neglect. From the inside, it felt like survival, and there is a misconception that inbreeding creates monsters overnight, that one forbidden union produces immediate horror. Reality is slower, more insidious. It erodes instead of explodes. Each generation loses a little more ground than the last, until decline feels natural, until dysfunction feels inherited, not inflicted, and by the time photographs were taken, grainy, black and white, stolen moments captured by journalists or researchers, the damage was visible even to those who didn't understand genetics. Faces that looked unfinished. Expressions frozen somewhere between childhood and confusion. Adults with the posture and mannerisms of children, aging bodies carrying minds that never fully arrived. And these images shocked the public when they surfaced. But for the family, there was no shock left to feel. This was their normal. This was what blood did. And still, no one left. And because leaving meant stepping into a world that had already judged them. A world that stared too long. That whispered words like degenerate and freak. The outside didn't offer compassion. It offered curiosity. And curiosity, to a family already drowning in shame they didn't know how to name, felt like cruelty. And so isolation tightened its grip. The bloodline closed ranks. And generation after generation, the legacy deepened. Not as a single act of horror, but as 1,000 quiet decisions to remain the same. And then beneath it all, written invisibly into every cell, the DNA kept score. It never forgot, it never forgave. It simply passed the damage forward one birth at a time. And by the time the outside world finally intervened, it was already too late to pretend this was coincidence. Patterns had become undeniable. Social workers, researchers, and officials arrived not with accusations, but with questions that had answers baked into them. Who was related to whom? Who had married whom? How many times the same names appeared on opposite sides of the same family tree? And what they uncovered wasn't chaos. It was structure. A closed system operating exactly as it had been for decades, and generations overlapped so tightly that siblings were sometimes mistaken for parents and uncles for brothers. Bloodlines ran parallel, then merged, then folded back again. In some cases, a child's grandparents were also their great-aunts and great-uncles. To an outsider, it looked like madness. To the family, it was simply how things had always been, and this is where the story turns darker. not because of what happened, but because of what didn't, and no one forced this to stop when it could have. No law stepped in early, no sustained medical intervention arrived in time. The family existed in a blind spot between sympathy and responsibility. Authorities hesitated, communities looked away, and so the legacy continued, protected not by secrecy, but by discomfort. And it is easier to ignore something you don't want to understand. And the children born during this period inherited more than genetic damage. They inherited isolation itself. Many never attended school. Those who did often dropped out early, mocked or misunderstood, labeled slow or strange without context. Teachers weren't trained for what they were seeing. Doctors weren't given access long enough to intervene. And the family, sensing judgment, retreated further inward, and silence became a shield. And as the years passed, something subtle but devastating occurred. The family's sense of time began to fracture. When you live surrounded only by people like yourself, when no one leaves and no one new arrives, history collapses. The past feels recent. The future feels abstract. You stop planning. You stop imagining. And children grew up believing this was all life could offer. Adults aged without ever questioning why their bodies hurt more, why their minds struggled, why death came so easily to those around them. Suffering wasn't dramatic, it was ambient. Like bad weather, you stop reacting to because it never clears, and researchers would later describe this as generational entrapment. Not just genetic, but psychological. A closed world produces closed thinking, and closed thinking reproduces itself just as reliably as DNA. And some family members sensed something was wrong. You can't erase instinct completely. A few expressed fear about having children. Others voiced confusion about why babies kept being born sick. But without education, without outside reference, those thoughts went nowhere. They were smothered by tradition, by pressure, by the unspoken rule that survival meant obedience. And so even doubt became inherited. And what makes this legacy especially disturbing is not just the physical damage, but the way it stripped choice from the future. Each new child arrived already compromised, not just biologically, but socially, born into a story already written, into a role already decided. The freedom to become something else had been quietly removed generations earlier, and when photographs and reports eventually reached the wider public, outrage followed. People demanded answers. How could this be allowed? Who failed these people? But outrage is easy in hindsight. It doesn't change what's already embedded in bone marrow and chromosomes. And for the family, the attention brought no relief. It brought exposure, and strangers arrived with cameras and notebooks. Faces that had lived in shadow were suddenly illuminated, analyzed, judged. Their pain became content. Their bodies became evidence. And while the world debated ethics and responsibility, the family was forced to confront something they had never been prepared to face. That their bloodline had become a warning, and not a legend. Not a rumor. A living example of what happens when isolation and fear override adaptation. And some members were eventually separated. A few children placed elsewhere. Medical care introduced too late to reverse what had already been passed down. The cycle slowed, but the damage did not disappear. You cannot unwrite DNA. You can only stop adding new lines to the page, and yet even now, the legacy lingers. Not just in surviving family members, but in the uncomfortable truth it exposes, that modern society is capable of looking directly at suffering and still choosing delay. That silence can be as destructive as cruelty. That neglect, when stretched across generations, becomes indistinguishable from intent. And this story forces a question many would rather avoid: how many other legacies are quietly forming right now, hidden in places we don't visit, among people we don't listen to. And because horror doesn't always announce itself, sometimes it waits patiently, passing itself down, one child at a time. And what unsettled researchers most wasn't just the physical evidence. It was the emotional flatness. By the time serious documentation began, many members of the bloodline no longer reacted to tragedy the way outsiders expected. Death did not shock them. Illness did not alarm them. Deformity did not frighten them. These things had become ordinary. Not because they were harmless, but because they were constant. And when suffering is everywhere, it stops feeling like an event and starts feeling like a condition of existence. And children learned early not to ask certain questions. Not because someone explicitly told them not to, but because no one ever answered when they did. Why does my brother look different? Why can't my sister talk? Why do people stare at us? The silence that followed taught them everything they needed to know, that some truths were not meant to be touched. And this is how damage survives. Not through denial alone, but through normalization. And inside the family, love still existed. That's what makes the story harder to face. Caregivers fed, clothed, and protected one another. Older siblings watched younger ones. Mothers grieved their losses even if they didn't fully understand them. There were moments of laughter, moments of warmth. Horror does not erase humanity. It coexists with it, and that coexistence is what traps people. And because when love is present, even in broken form, leaving feels like abandonment. Breaking the cycle would have required someone to walk away from everyone they had ever known into a world that already viewed them as damaged. For many, staying felt safer than risking rejection elsewhere. And so the family endured in place, quietly shrinking in potential with each passing decade. And medical experts later described what they saw in clinical terms: compounded recessive disorders, cognitive impairment, musculoskeletal abnormalities. But those words flatten the experience. They don't capture what it means to wake up every day in a body that never quite obeys you, or to grow old without ever understanding why life feels so hard. And they don't capture the frustration of knowing something is wrong, but not having the language to explain it. And as the story spread, people searched for villains. Parents were blamed. Grandparents were condemned. Entire generations were judged as ignorant or immoral. But blame, like attention, arrived too late. Condemnation doesn't heal genetic damage. Shame doesn't reverse inheritance. And the truth is more disturbing than a simple villain narrative. This legacy survived because it was ignored, because intervention felt uncomfortable, because no one wanted to decide where cultural respect ended and responsibility began, because stepping in would have required admitting that isolation, when left unchecked, can become lethal. And so time did what it always does in neglected systems. It compounded the problem, and one generation passed down not just DNA, but coping mechanisms built around limitation. Children were taught what not to expect from life. Don't dream too big. Don't trust outsiders. Don't imagine futures that require leaving. Survival became the highest ambition. Flourishing was never on the table. And when you remove aspiration, you remove resistance. And eventually, a strange inversion occurred. The family became known not despite their suffering, but because of it. Their pain turned into a spectacle. Documentaries, articles, whispered references in academic circles. They were discussed, analyzed, cited, rarely understood. And for those still living within the legacy, this attention didn't feel like recognition. It felt like exposure, like being seen without being helped, like having your worst inheritance displayed as a cautionary tale for others while you remain trapped inside it. And there is a quiet cruelty in that. And because even when the cycle began to slow, even when intervention reduced the number of new births, the past did not release its grip. Adults carried impairments they would never outgrow. Families mourned futures that were never possible. The damage had already been paid forward, and the bill could not be returned. And this is the part of the story most people avoid. The aftermath. Not the shocking images, not the headlines, but the long, dull ache of lives lived with consequences no one chose directly, yet everyone inherited. And it leaves us with an unsettling realization: DNA is not just biology, it is memory. It records decisions long after the decision makers are gone. It preserves fear, isolation, and neglect in molecular form, passing them silently from parent to child. And this legacy was not written in one generation. It was authored slowly, collaboratively, by absence. By the absence of education, the absence of intervention, the absence of imagination. And once written, it did what all legacies do. It demanded to be remembered, even by those who wish it had never existed. And by the fifth generation affected by this collapse, something irreversible had happened. The family no longer saw itself as a family in the way the rest of the world understands the word. It had become a containment unit, a closed loop designed not to grow, but to endure. And survival replaced progress, endurance replaced hope, and children were no longer born into possibility. They were born into maintenance, into a system already stretched thin, already exhausted, already shaped by loss. Parenting became less about guidance and more about management, keeping people fed, clothed, calm. Dreams were unnecessary, futures were impractical, and this is where the true horror settles in, not in visible deformities, but in the erosion of imagination. And when a child cannot picture a different life, they cannot escape the one they inherit. When a community has no reference point for normalcy, dysfunction stops being questioned. And when suffering becomes routine, it stops triggering alarm, and it becomes background noise. And some members of the bloodline reached adulthood with a quiet awareness that something was deeply wrong. They felt it in their bodies, in the way tasks that seemed easy for others felt impossible, in the way their thoughts moved slower, stalled more often, circled instead of advanced. They noticed the stares when they ventured beyond familiar territory. They noticed the tone people used, careful, cautious, sometimes cruel. But awareness without tools is its own kind of prison. And they were never taught how genetics worked, never shown diagrams, never told that love, when restricted to the same blood again and again, becomes destructive. Without that knowledge, self-blame filled the gap. People assumed they were simply lesser, broken by chance, punished by fate, and that belief is devastating. because it removes responsibility from the system and places it entirely on the individual. And as attention increased, the family's identity fractured further. Some internalized shame, others leaned into defiance. A few rejected the outside world completely, convinced that judgment was worse than damage. In their minds, the world didn't care about their suffering, it cared about observing it, and then that wasn't entirely wrong, and the story was consumed as spectacle long before it was treated as a warning. Viewers stared at faces frozen in photographs. Commentators debated ethics from a distance, but few asked the most important question: how many generations does neglect need before it becomes indistinguishable from abuse? And this legacy exposes a truth America rarely confronts: progress is uneven. While some communities surge forward, others are left behind, not by accident but by inaction. And when isolation meets ignorance, biology does what biology always does. It records the cost, and by this point in the story, there is no clean resolution, no moment where everything turns around, no sudden rescue that erases what came before. There are only slowed cycles, fewer births, slightly better care, damage control where prevention should have been. And if you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? And would you have stayed loyal to family, even knowing what it was doing to your future? Or would you have walked away, carrying the guilt of survival alone? And that question matters, because it reveals how fragile the idea of choice really is, and most people like to believe they would leave, that they would be the exception. But choice requires clarity, it requires support. It requires the belief that something better exists on the other side. For many trapped in this legacy, those conditions never existed, and so the bloodline did what it was designed to do. It continued, weakened but intact, long enough to become a lesson written into academic journals and whispered into documentaries like this one, and not as entertainment, and as evidence, and evidence that horror does not always wear claws or carry weapons. Sometimes it wears familiarity. Sometimes it looks like tradition. Sometimes it survives because it feels kinder to do nothing than to intervene. And perhaps the most disturbing realization of all is this: the DNA didn't just record the family's choices, it recorded society's silence, every untreated condition, every delayed intervention, every moment where discomfort outweighed responsibility. And those things live on, encoded, long after the conversations end. And this legacy is not just about blood, it is about what happens when no one is willing to break it. And what remains after the cycle slows is not peace, it is residue. Lives shaped by decisions made long before consent was possible. Adults who carry the physical and cognitive weight of history in every movement, every sentence, every silence. And this is the phase no one prepares for, when the horror is no longer active, but it is still alive, and there are family members who survived long enough to witness the world learning their name, to hear themselves described in terms they never chose, to understand in fragments that their suffering had become symbolic, that their lives were now shorthand for something broken in the American story. And imagine realizing you are not remembered for who you are, but for what went wrong before you were born. And for some, that realization came with anger, for others with numbness. A few tried to speak, but language failed them. How do you explain a life where limitation was normal, where pain was inherited, where the idea of before doesn't exist because the damage predates memory, and the public often asks why no one rebelled earlier, why no one escaped sooner, why the cycle wasn't broken at the first sign of harm. But those questions assume an even playing field. They assume access to knowledge, to resources, to alternatives, and they assume freedom where there was only containment. And breaking a genetic cycle requires more than courage. It requires understanding that the cycle exists. It requires belief that intervention will help rather than punish. It requires trust in systems that have historically ignored or exploited people like you. And for this family, trust was never cultivated. It was eroded. And so when help finally arrived, it felt invasive. When attention followed, it felt predatory. And when the story went public, it felt like confirmation that the outside world was not there to save them, only to study them. And this reaction is uncomfortable to acknowledge, but necessary, because it exposes a hard truth. Intervention without empathy is just observation with authority, and observation alone does not heal, and the legacy's final damage is psychological. A learned helplessness passed down alongside faulty genes. A belief that effort changes nothing, that fate is fixed, that suffering is personal rather than systemic, and that belief doesn't disappear when conditions improve. It lingers, it shapes behavior, it limits recovery, and even after the bloodline thinned, even after the most dangerous patterns slowed, the people left behind carried the echo of what had been. Their lives were quieter, safer, but still constrained by bodies and minds that had been shaped in isolation. And this is where the story stops being about them alone, And because this legacy forces us to confront something deeply unsettling, the line between tradition and harm is not always obvious to the people living inside it. It becomes obvious only in retrospect, when damage has already compounded beyond repair, and we like to believe history's worst mistakes are loud, that they announce themselves, that they wear uniforms or wave flags. But this one didn't. It whispered, it repeated, it waited, and it survived because it felt familiar. And if it survived once, it can survive again. Anywhere isolation is allowed to harden into permanence. Anywhere education fails to reach. Anywhere intervention is postponed out of politeness or fear of overstepping. And this story is not a relic. It is a warning encoded in real flesh and blood. And the most inbred legacy written in DNA is not horrifying because it is rare. It is horrifying because it is possible. Because it required no villain, only absence. No malice, only neglect. No conspiracy, only time. And in time, when left unchecked, is merciless, and what we inherit is not just our ancestors' strengths. We inherit their mistakes, their fears, their silences, and when those silences go unchallenged, they do not fade, they deepen, and this family's story is ending, slowly, painfully. But the lesson it leaves behind is still unfinished. It waits for us to decide whether we will recognize the signs earlier next time, or whether we will once again look away, comforted by distance until damage becomes undeniable. And there is a temptation, at the end of stories like this, to search for closure, to believe that awareness alone is enough, that by naming what happened, by documenting it, by turning it into history, we somehow put it to rest. But legacies written in DNA do not end cleanly, and they fade unevenly. They linger in bodies that outlive attention, in minds that never fully escape the conditions that shaped them, in families who must continue living after the cameras leave, after the articles stop circulating, after the public decides it has learned enough. And for those born into this bloodline, there is no final chapter that feels complete. There is only adaptation, learning how to live inside consequences you did not choose, learning how to carry a past that the world knows but does not feel. And perhaps the most unsettling part is this: nothing about this legacy required cruelty to begin. No one set out to create it. No one planned its outcome. It emerged from love turned inward, from fear of outsiders, from isolation mistaken for safety. And that is what makes it dangerous. And because it means the conditions that created this story still exist, quietly, scattered across places we rarely examine, in communities that distrust help because help has failed them before, in families where tradition is defended not because it works, but because it is all that remains. And this story asks us to sit with a question that has no comfortable answer: how much suffering must accumulate before intervention becomes obligation? And because by the time the damage is visible to everyone, it is already too late for someone. And the most inbred legacy written in DNA is not just a warning about genetics. It is a warning about silence, about what happens when problems that make us uncomfortable are allowed to persist because addressing them feels complicated, political, or invasive. And history is full of tragedies born from action, but some of the worst are born from inaction, stretched across generations until responsibility becomes diffuse and blame evaporates. And DNA, however, does not forget, and it remembers every repetition, every narrowing of the gene pool, every moment when the cycle could have been broken but wasn't. It remembers not just the family's choices, but society's hesitation. And so this story ends the way it began, quietly, not with an explosion, not with resolution, but with a truth that settles slowly, heavily, and refuses to leave. And that horror does not always arrive from the outside, and sometimes it grows patiently inside what we call family, inside what we call tradition, inside what we choose not to question. And then by the time we finally look closely enough to understand it, it has already written itself into the next generation. And this archive is now open. You've seen what was buried. What you do with that knowledge, whether you remember it, whether you recognize it elsewhere, whether you act sooner next time, is the part of the story that has not yet been written.